Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee. And as always, can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones or electronic devices because it does interfere with our sound systems. Apologies have been received from Adam Ingram, and Jim Eadie is attending his first meeting of the committee as Adam Ingram's substitute. Can I welcome Mr Eadie to the committee today, and thank you very much for coming along. Could I also place on record my thanks to all the committee members and the clerking team for the support during my recent medical absence, and it's nice to be back, and can I particularly thank Chick Brodie for convening two of the committees in my absence. Agenda item 1 is declaration of interests. The first item on our agenda is the declaration of interest by Jim Eadie. In accordance with section 3 of the Code of Conduct, can I invite Jim Eadie to declare any interests relevant to the remit of the committee. Mr Eadie.
Thank you, Convener. I have nothing to add to the entry which appears in the Register of Members' Interests.
Thank you for that. Agenda item 2 is consideration of current petition. The next item of business is evidence on PE 1383 by Helen McDade on behalf of the John Muir Trust on better protection for wild land. As previously agreed, the committee will take evidence from the Scottish Government ministers. So can I welcome today Paul Wheelhouse, who's the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change, Derek Mackay, who is the Minister for Local Government and Planning, and some of the key officials today are Keith Connell, who's the Deputy Director of National Resources Division, and John McNary, who's the Chief Planner for the Scottish Government. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming along today, and can invite Mr Wheelhouse to make a short opening statement of up to a maximum of 5 minutes. Mr Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to give evidence to your committee in its consideration of the John Muir Trust petition on wild land. My colleague Derek Mackay is here too, as the Scottish Government's proposals for protecting wild land are part and parcel of planning policy which falls within his portfolio. I would like to start by saying something about my understanding of wild land. I'm aware that there is no single definition, that people may have differing views, although many think of it as remote mountain and moorland. Even where the layperson perceives land to be wild, in fact, it may be the output from a managed landscape rather than natural wildness. I appreciate too that the quality of wildness can reflect personal expectations and can be experienced in a range of settings, even close to settlements. However, for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm guided by the S&H consideration of wildness. They advise that there are 4 physical attributes of land which can be measured and mapped. Naturalness of land cover, ruggedness of terrain, remoteness and visible lack of modern artefacts. Taken together, these constitute what many would recognise as wildness. Indeed, these attributes were used by S&H to produce a map of relative wildness across Scotland in 2012. As the committee is aware, S&H continued its mapping work to advise and inform ministers in their deliberations on planning policy. The third National Planning Framework Main Issues Report and Draft Framework, together with a revised Scottish planning policy, were published at the end of April for consultation. S&H's map of core wild land areas was also published, and Scottish planning policy recognises the need to safeguard areas of wildland character from intrusive human development, and, for the first time, there is an explicit reference to a wildland map in the planning documents associated with the consultation. The context in which this map is presented is important. First, NPF 3 proposes a spatial strategy to help make Scotland a low-carbon place, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. To do this, we have to set out the need to support onshore wind energy development in appropriate locations, and in doing so, strike a balance between supporting development and protecting landscapes and wild land. The revised Scottish planning policy says that the Scottish Government does not wish to see wind farms in national parks and in national scenic areas, our very best landscapes. It also says we want to continue strong protection for our wildest land, as shown in S&H's core wildland map. This means that wind farm development would only be appropriate in core wildland areas where significant effects can be mitigated and overcome. This explicit link between planning policy, specifically regarding renewables, and S&H's core wildland map will provide clarity that has not been available before. NPF 3 makes clear that ministers do not intend to legislate for a new environmental designation, and that core wildland areas would not be designated under statute. I also wish to highlight that the map of wildland identifies some 20% of the area of Scotland as being core wildland, which is a significant increase on the position in 2002, when S&H identified in a fairly broad brush way some 13% as search areas for wildland. The reason for this is clear. S&H is measuring and mapping of the 4 wild attributes plus use of new GIS technology allows for more precision. Consultees are being asked whether they agree with our proposal that we use the SNH mapping work to identify more clearly those areas of wildland which need to be protected. Some of the early reactions include a comment from Cameron McNeish, a long-time critic of wind farms, who said, "As far as I'm aware, no European government has put an outright ban on wind turbines on particular areas of their country that are seen as nationally important in terms of landscape quality. The much criticised Scottish Government could well be the first to do so." And the John Muir Trust have commented, and I quote, "We are pleased that the Scottish Government now recognises the importance of wildland as an important part of our cultural heritage and international profile." I would like to take this opportunity to encourage all those with an interest in wildland to respond by Tuesday, 23rd of July. And Convener, Mr Mackay and I now look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr Wheelis, and obviously I encourage Mr Mackay to intervene at any time if he wishes to clarify. I'm sure some of our questions go to him as well. If I could start with a couple of questions, then I'll go to my colleague Chick Brodie, and then we'll go around some other committee members. Just for a couple of points, first of all, for the record, and I think that some of the points you've made in your submission we already have covered these, but just so I'm totally clear, are John Muir Trust right to argue that core areas of wild land are not being allocated the same status as national parks?
That is correct. My understanding is that national parks and national scenic areas will effectively, the government is saying to the industry that we do not want wind farms to be developed in those areas, specifically onshore wind farms. Whereas wildland does have additional protection over and above the existing planning policy, but that wind farms could take place, but only where substantial mitigation was put in place to overcome the effects of the wind farms. I don't know whether Mr Mackay would want to add to that.
Yes, thanks, Convener. To be clear, the Group 1 designation as it relates to wind farms is a complete ban where wind farms are not acceptable in the national parks and the national scenic areas. And Group 2 is where there's significant protection, and as Mr Wheelhouse has said, mitigation would have to be deployed for a wind farm to proceed in such an area, but that protection is strengthened from the previous position, and that's what we're currently consulting upon.
Thank you. The question Mr Wheelhouse and perhaps again Mr Mackay, clearly some core wildland isn't in the national park area and isn't in national scenic areas. Could the Minister give me an estimation of what proportion of wildland does not come within the currents of either of these designations?
I could hazard a guess that I'm sure I read in a briefing note that some 40%.
42.3.
I was close. 42.3% of core land is in such an area, so the remainder is not in either of the two designations. So that's almost 60%.
Go. And just to clarify, and I think you've made this clear, Mr Wales, in your statement, that the government will not legislate for new environmental designations in Scotland. Is that correct?
Certainly, we have no proposals at this stage in respect of wildland to designate it as an environmental designation.
Well, my final question before I bring in Mr Brodie, could I just clarify then where the beef is in this proposal? Let me give you an example. The Highland Council in my patch on the 21st of May raised no objections to two large wind farm developments on wildland, despite objections from SNH on wildland issues. If there's no wildland designation, where's the teeth? What's stopping speculative applications for large-scale developments on wildland? Why not have a designation, stop the burden of protracted legal wrangles and costly public local inquiries? Mr Mackay?
I think what we have now, what we're proposing, is much greater clarity in the system. And of course I wouldn't want to prejudice any application, either live or future application. And what the proposals we've outlined in the Scottish Planning Policy and the National Planning Framework will do is give that greater clarity. You see, it's not just land designation, but it's also cumulative impact, it's also separation distances and other factors that come into play when considering any planning decision. Every planning decision is taken on a case-by-case analysis and its merits are considered, so a range of issues would be taken into account, and ultimately it would be for the determining authority to give weight to each consideration. But I think these policies will give, as proposed, much greater clarity on what the position is by creating the four categories and being specific by what we mean, and that's exactly why we're consulting on them right now. And where local authorities would have a particular view, that's important, so are the designations, but there's clear what considerations would be taken into account in each.
And Mr Waterhouse?
So I was White House last week, according to Keith Brown, but I've got a new one this week. Sorry, I couldn't resist the opportunity. It's worth stating in terms of designation.
You're going to get much harder questions after that reply, I can tell you.
Sorry, convener. It's worth stating that designation does not itself confer an absolute bar on any or all development. I think that's important to recognise. So even if a designation was in place, it's still appropriately cited development can take place in national parks, for example. Development can be considered even in Natura sites, subject to appropriate mitigation, etc. So I think in terms of when it comes to environmental designations, some people are suggesting that if wildland was designated, that would be a complete stop in any development, and it's worth just stating that where there are designations of an environmental nature, development can still take place, subject to appropriate mitigation.
Does the Scottish Government have a policy of rewilding of land, such as in Wild Innerdale in the Lake District?
Well, what the Scottish Government is increasingly doing is looking at landscape scale sort of ecosystem projects and looking at habitats as a whole. We have clearly, in terms of biodiversity strategy, and we're soon to launch our refreshed biodiversity strategy, looking at opportunities to try and restore habitats which will support a number of species which are under threat or could be under threat as a result of excuse me, climate change. And that is leading us to look at larger scale, landscape scale projects and taking a more ecosystem approach to protecting our natural heritage. Clearly, wildland areas do have significant conservation benefits in the sense there's not competing sort of demands there in terms of development pressures, and so they are sort of naturally do form sort of refuges for different species. But the approach we're taking is about trying to take an ecosystems approach, and that's in areas where there is development as well as areas where there's not development.
If I may add as well, convener, I think it would be wrong to presume that it's either the environment or economic growth. Actually, both can work in harmony. The government's overarching objective is sustainable economic growth. And I'll give you one example also proposed in the National Planning Framework, and that's the Central Scotland Green Network, where we are integrating economic opportunity with protecting and enhancing the environment. That, in addition to the strategies that my colleague and Minister has outlined in terms of reforestation and other programmes and interplaying ecosystems. The planning system is about the right development in the right places, and that includes protecting the environment. So I believe that the balance that we propose to strike is the right one between greater protection for valued parts of the environment and also growth where appropriate.
Chuck Brodie.
Thank you. Good morning, Ministers. Mr Connell, Mr McNerney. Minister, there's no such thing as wild land, is there?
Well, I mean, I said out earlier in my statement, there are real issues in terms of subjectivity around defining what wildland is. As ministers, what we have had to do is fall back and where we can have a relatively scientific or evidence-based approach to developing what we would understand to be those areas that are most in line with what people would perceive to be wildland, and that's the SNH four characteristics that I referred to earlier. But you're absolutely right, Mr Brodie, that there's always going to be an element of subjectivity about defining what is wild and what is not. And indeed, as I said earlier on, many of our landscapes which people would, from a lay perspective, would perceive to be wild are actually the result of managed activity over a long period of time.
Yeah. I hear what you say, and you mentioned SNH, but at the last meeting we had the Chief Executive of SNH saying, and I quote, "We cannot offer a clear definition of what is or what is not wild land," to be followed by the Chairman of SNH saying, "We have been seeking a tighter definition that will help everybody." What's the point of SNH if they can't come up with the definition that you're looking for?
I think it goes back. I mean, I've got the quotes from Ian Jardine from the previous meeting, and I appreciate where you're coming from. However, I think it is because it is such a subjective issue. I mean, if you lined 100 people up, in front of an area of landscape and said, "Would you regard it as wild?" you might get quite a different answer from those individuals. So
that's the point. This is not about wildland at all. This is about wind turbines.
Well, I mean,
you yourself have mentioned it 5 times in the opening debate. I've got reams of paper here that mentions wind farms. It's got nothing to do with wildland.
It has, I mean, wildland, one of the 4 characteristics is about the degree to which land is, contains sort of artefacts, I think is the term that SNH used, but if essentially, is there obtrusive human development in that context? So that is one of the objective criteria on which SNH have based their map. And clearly, large turbines in particular, onshore turbines, and to be fair, other types of structure like pylons and other man-made structures can impact on the perception of somewhere as wild. So I think that's a relatively objective basis on which to go.
Well, let's try some more objectivity. We're talking, I say it's about wind farms, largely, but we, SNH, produced, or Wildland Research Institute, the University of Leeds, produced a report for the Scottish Government. And they talked about wildland. But then they said, in Scotland, effort to safeguard wildland is focused on maintaining the qualities that are valued for recreational purposes. So we don't want wind turbines, but everybody can traipse across it as much as they like. Isn't that the case?
Well, it's not. I mean, in terms of my view of where we sit in terms of wild land, I think it's much more than just whether people can use it for recreation. Personally, my view would be.
But then it's not wild.
Based
It's
on
being
previous
used for
planning.
recreational purposes.
Well, I mean, it's wild land. Obviously, clearly, in some cases, wild land, people are accessing wild land by man-made structures such as roads to get there. So there's obviously some degree of intrusion by man into these locations. But existing planning policy says most sensitive landscapes have little or no capacity to accept new development. Areas of wild land character in some of Scotland's remote or upland, mountain and coastal areas are very sensitive to any form of development, so not just wind farms. Or intrusive human activity, and planning authorities should safeguard the character of these areas in the development plan. The debate we're having today is largely centred on wind farms. I accept that, Mr. Brodie, but there is also the need to protect wildland from obtrusive human development of more than one kind. So it's not just about wind farms. Wind farms are perhaps if you like, the most current example of development pressure that there is in these areas. But Mr. Mackay may wish to add to that.
Thank you, Convener. I can say that my energies are spent where required, and they have been required in this particular area because there have been clear calls to clarify. And there is this opportunity through the Scottish Planning Policy Review, which I'm conducting at the same time as the National Planning Framework, which was set in statute in terms of how we go forward, the transition to the low-carbon economy and realising the immense potential of this country. So it's in that context that there's an opportunity to clarify existing policy. Mr. Brodie's absolutely correct that the designation and the specifications around wind turbines and wind farms is separate to other development issues. Again, the overarching objective of sustainable economic growth continues, but we are giving greater clarity on what are appropriate areas of search for local authorities and finding the right place to locate turbines. And SNH, of course, are the advisors on relevant natural heritage matters, and they have drawn up what they perceive to be wild land. Of course, that is a different designation and category that they've given us from before, the areas of wild land, the previous designation from what we have now. It's actually more robust and sophisticated, what we have now, on the basis of the 4 key themes of perceived naturalness, of land cover, ruggedness of terrain, remoteness of public roads, and the visible lack of buildings. But that specifically feeds into the maps using GIS technology to then inform what is appropriate in terms of the Group 2 in the category as it relates to wind turbines. But of course, we're having a different discussion on general development that has a slightly different perspective. What that has done, of course, is increased the land from the previous zoning from area of search of areas of wild land from 2002 from 12.7% to core areas of wild land for 2013 at 20.3%. So that has informed our work, and it's that presumption that we're consulting upon as part of the designation. But the member's absolutely correct. If we move away from wind turbines into other kinds of development, different factors come into play But that's why I would return to the core of planning policy, which is that each case is determined on its merits, looking at the range of planning policies and advice notes that come into play. I hope that assists the member.
I think it was very helpful. I just wonder if you can help me with something. We're talking about wildland. On the basis of the mapping work that's been done by SNH, who owns the land and what discussions have been taking place with that with reference to the definition of their land being wildland?
The planning system, I should say, is generally blind to ownership in any application. Land use, in terms of what comes into the system, the planning system looks at the characteristics of the application as opposed to ownership, although we do consider as a material consideration community benefit and, of course, economic impact of any application as part of the system. And my proposals currently being consulted upon, there's even greater weighting on economic impact as a material consideration in any planning application, but we're generally blind to ownership because the planning system should be about land use, not who owns it. But maybe Mr Wheelhouse wants to comment further on consultations.
Indeed, I think if you relate this discussion to SNH's purpose, which is to secure the conservation, or one of them is to secure the conservation and enhancement of nature and landscapes, that again, similarly to the planning system, doesn't, if you like, have to take into account who owns the land. I mean, it would be a farce if we had a situation where a landscape was deemed to be of value to protect that land up to the point where it would be changed into a private ownership, and suddenly we wouldn't want to protect that landscape anymore because we didn't have any control over it. So we've got to take into account the value of our landscapes, irrespective of who owns them. In a similar way to the planning system, it's blind to ownership in that respect.
I understand that, but it would be helpful given that in another committee we found that only 21% of Scotland's land is registered, and we know who we don't know who owns the land. So, given the discussions that we've had with regard to wind farm applications in particular, one would hope to have a much stronger emphasis on community ownership rather than some of the propagation of some of these farms by land ownership. And I don't see how you're going to overcome that if a landowner in our designated wild land decides they want to do something either along those lines or indeed for recreational purposes.
Well, if I may, convener, just refer to the fact that as the Minister responsible for the Land Reform Review Group, that I know the group are taking forward in their second phase of their work a very significant extent. Their efforts will focus on community ownership. So I would hope that those issues will be debated, and who gains from renewables projects and who gains from other economic development in areas is obviously a key consideration that I'll take into account.
I wonder if I may ask one last question, convener. The mapping work done by SNH took 2.5 years to produce. The N3 indicator is going to take 3 years. How can a government body be allowed to move goalposts without? Does it do enough checking beforehand as to what's involved, or does it take a finger in the air approach to some of these things? What monitoring is there of bodies such as SNH to achieve delivery of projects as and when they said they would?
Well, SNH is subject to annual review, just like other parts of the public sector, and it'd be fair to say I'm aware that there's been a long time scale to develop the maps, but the maps themselves have involved a number of different iterations. There's been a degree of, obviously, even in the case of the maps we've got now, a degree of judgment involved by SNH as to what criteria to use. But once that has been determined, they then take a scientific approach to developing the outputs, so they're evidence-based, having taken into account the judgment as to which criteria should be considered. That does involve a certain amount of time. As to whether it could have been faster, that's something we can look at in due course. But we have the maps now. I would encourage those who have a view on their use in respect of the NPF3 and planning policy to take part in the consultation, as I've said, which closes on the 23rd of July. So they have ample opportunity to feed in their views on the appropriateness of using these maps and any concerns they have about how they've been generated.
Mackay, did you want to come in?
I'll just add very briefly, by way of reassurance to the member, that I meet regularly with all key agencies that interface with the planning system. There are targets in terms of how they perform, and I have senior high-level meetings regularly with them to make sure that they live up to the expectations of the government, and they're contributing in a Team Scotland approach to our overarching objective, which I'll say one more time, sustainable economic growth.
Thank you. Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not sure that Edinburgh Southern has much in the way of wild land, although we do have some protected and beautiful green space. But I just wondered if I could seek further clarification on something that the Minister for Environment and Climate Change mentioned in his opening remarks. She said that statutory designation does not confer a bar on development. Development can still take place subject to appropriate mitigation. I just wondered, therefore, when you were weighing up whether or not to provide a statutory designation for wild land, and no doubt being advised by the experts on either side of you as to what the appropriate course of action would be, what was the compelling argument for deciding that wild land should not be given the same status as national parks?
Speaking for my side of the house, I mean, some of the considerations that we took into account were that the designation, if there was a designation, would potentially have a hard line on the ground, given the subjectivity around wild land, which Chick Brodie has alluded to, and which I agree is a factor. There's always inherently an element of subjectivity in such matters, even when the map ultimately has been based on a rigorous approach, following a kind of subjective judgment as to what criteria would be put in place. The map has then been generated on a sort of scientific basis thereafter. There's always an element for disagreement as to what constitutes wildness and wild land. We took the view we didn't need an extra designation. For onshore wind, for example, our focus on identifying the main areas of wildland character which are significant in a national context.
So is it just about definition then? You can define what a national park is, but you can't easily define.
Yes, I mean is
that the compelling argument?
That's a fair point to make, Mr. Eadie. I think it's much easier to take an absolute, like a national park boundary, and say that is the boundary. When it comes to wildness, it's a harder thing to pin down.
Thank you.
Anne Mishaggart, and then Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome to the Ministers and the panel members. Really just going back to my colleague Chick Brodie's about timetable, and what involvement had the Scottish Government whilst the setting of the timetable? Did you have involvement within it?
Anne McTaggart will be well aware of the discussions around national planning framework and Scottish planning policy, because we discussed it just last week at Local Government Regeneration Committee, where I think I went in some detail the engagement and the participation process in these policies. I'm not compelled to consult on Scottish planning policy in the same way that I have to on National Planning Framework 3, but the Government took the decision to do so. We've published a participation statement, who will engage with, how, where, when, why, and all of that's in the public domain. There'll be parliamentary scrutiny. Indeed, it kicked off last week at that committee. We'll have further exposure going forward. The main issues report will progress to our recommendations that will be considered by Parliament in relation to Scottish planning policy. Because of the timescales and 12-week consultation period, we can implement the policies by the end of this year, the very start of next year. But for the statutory timetable, the MPF 3 will be adopted in June 2014. That's the current timescale. Of course, it's very important to make the point, and I thank the member for giving me the opportunity to do this, that existing policies apply until new policies are adopted. But there's full and comprehensive engagement with all our proposals in terms of these planning policies. And so I think the member can be reassured about the breadth and depth of stakeholders that will be engaged with as this goes forward, from the man and woman on the street to the academic expert in the field of expertise.
Thank you.
Jackson Carlow.
Thank you. A couple of lines of inquiries. Good morning. I'm very impressed with the coordination between you, quite the Anton deck of the ministerial tower. 2 lines of inquiry. First of all, we now have this map from Scottish National Heritage. Did either of you or your predecessors or your officials see an earlier version of this map at any time which included a greater spread of designated land to potentially be defined as wildland?
I have seen many variations of the maps as they've emerged and evolved over a period of time. Indeed, in the documents that I've published in National Planning Framework 3, there's a variation of maps. So yes, I've seen a variation, and also previous maps, new maps. So there's a range of illustrations of what Scotland looks like depending on the indicators and the definitions and the specifications you choose to deploy. What we've arrived at is what we felt was the right balance that arrives at the figures I think I've already mentioned, which is around a third of the country with significant or greater protection in terms of the policies as they relate to wind farms.
For my part, the only maps which have shown a wider extent of coverage have been relative wilderness maps, which underpin the core wildland map that we're now working to in terms of the NPF3 and Scottish Planning Policy consultations. So therefore, there's no map I've seen which has had a wider definition of core wildland, if that's
so you can both offer the committee the assurance that at no point then did you as ministers, your predecessors or your officials have a conversation with Scottish National Heritage where you suggested to them that you would prefer to see a scaling down of any plan to define wild land.
It is perfectly acceptable for SNH to produce any map that they choose, and it's then for ministers to determine what advice we take forward to put in our proposals, and then it's for any committee or any member of this Parliament to propose an alternative. So we have used the map as it stands of wildness that we think is appropriate for the purposes I think we've set out. But of course there are alternatives that other members may wish to choose. You could draw up a map of Scotland that could say no wind farm, no development anywhere, but we think we've struck
I'm not
the right
asking.
balance.
I'm not asking for that. I was simply asking. I don't think I've quite got the assurance that I was seeking. Whether, as I said, ministers, your predecessors or your officials had a conversation with Scottish National Heritage where you invited them to produce a map that reduced the scope of the wildland proposal?
No. What we have asked for is advice on what considerations can be taken into account. For example, the definition that we provided that I mentioned earlier with the 4 key characteristics of wild land, that's produced a map. That's what we have included in our consultation document in the environmental impact assessment, and that's what I propose to use to guide planning policy going forward.
Okay. Mr. Whelan?
For my part, I have not asked SNH to scale back the coverage of wildland. I can't speak for previous periods, so just to confirm that's my understanding of the position before I was a minister. Maybe Keith Connell can address the period prior to me.
I'm grateful for that. What is the average? I mean, how many? I won't ask how many wind turbines there are, but I mean, having approved so many of them, you'll be able to tell me the average height.
I could defer to
I'm happy to. Mr. Carlaw's probing question may be appropriate, but I'll obviously have to go back and see if we hold such information.
No.
I don't know it off the top
reason
of my
I
head.
ask is because you talked about mitigation, and I understand how we can mitigate against a bothy for hill walkers or a visitor centre. I'm not quite sure how you mitigate against a wind turbine, the average height of which seems to me to be quite often several hundred feet. I mean, do we paint it as a giant thistle? I mean, when you talk about mitigation as being the protection against the development of these in wild land, I'm at a loss, actually, as to decide what mitigation is. Now, it seems to me it's all very lily-livered of you to decide that you're not going to underpin this in statute. And it's all very well for bland assertions from erudite, virile and thrusting ministers to say that, of course, with mitigation, there need not be any concern about the development of these in wild land. But I mean, give me an example of the sort of mitigation against a wind turbine that you would think appropriate.
Well, for example, we wouldn't paint it the colours of a thistle. I dare say that would draw attention to it. An example of mitigation would be location, for example, so that they're not in a particularly prominent place. So the site can be moved, for example. They can be screened. There's the issue of cumulative impact as well, in terms of how they're located. So these are examples of how you would locate turbines so they are not as prominent as they may otherwise have been, for example.
Not sure it's really a definition of mitigation. So essentially, there is no particular protection arising whatsoever as a result of the government's favoured approach.
Can I just state, I mean, the number of factors might be taken into account in terms of landscape impacts, such as the height of the turbines. Clearly, you could have a revised proposal that came down in height. You could, as Mr Mackay has alluded to, you could re-site on a different position so they were less obtrusive, and you might vary the number of turbines. So there are means by which an individual site or proposal that comes forward might be mitigated in terms of its impact, short of actually removing the turbines altogether.
I'm great for you. I mean, I do think that's helpful. Essentially, what you're saying is that wind turbines can carry on regardless, provided that they are the right height, they are the right quantity, and that from a particular angle they can't be seen. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think I said carry on regardless. Although I'm sure
well,
that's
there is no protection.
I'm sure that's a good movie, but
it's just your desire and wish that these factors be taken into account. But there's no statutory underpinning of any of this. That's just your opinion, really, rather than any particular authority which would require to be observed.
Oh, I would cite much greater authority than myself. I would cite, for example, Mary Scanlon, MSP, who said in debate that we've been waiting a long time for these policies and we welcome them. Or Murdo Fraser, who says that the government was stealing the Conservatives' policy, so it appears there is some support for the policy approach. The preferred approach, as Mr Carlaw has described it. For example, we're also proposing an extension of the distance from settlement cities, towns and villages in where turbines can be located from 2 kilometres to 2.5. I know the preferred position as it stands from the Conservatives is 2k, but we propose extending that somewhat to take in view of the opinions that are quite rightly expressed from local communities. But I say again, it is for local planners to determine applications based on the circumstances that are presented to get the right development in the right places. And the members referred to no greater protection. In fact, we're proposing for the first time a complete ban in some parts of Scotland and greater protection in another third. And if you consider the separation distance, the cumulative impact, the urban nature of the rest of Scotland, that's quite a substantial shift in where our position is. And I think it does strike the right balance between the transition to a low-carbon economy and also protecting the environment.
The other aspect, if I may, Convener, just add in terms of the, Mr Carlaw suggests that we carry on regardless. There are other factors which are taken into account in any application of any type in an area which we have an environmental designation, such as the impact on the natural environment more generally in terms of wildlife issues and hydrology and so forth. So there are a number of factors which are taken into account, not just the visual impact.
Just finally, as Mr Mackay, we tend not to pursue matters in partisan political party lines within the Petitions Committee. I'm here representing the interests of the petitioner who has made these points to me, and I'm simply representing them to you. I think that it's...
I'm simply relying on great sources of information from your own party.
Said with all the sincerity you can muster at your best performance, Minister. But I return to the fact that an underpinning of this in statute, which is, I think, what the petitioner is seeking, would have afforded the sort of protection that is looked for. And I understand the point about general development, but I mean, surely even you can draw a distinction between the sort of sympathetic development that is of assistance to those taking advantage of wild land and the slightly more commercial development of wild land with something as intrusive as a wind turbine. I mean, I accept your proposition that is underpinning a lot of this, but is there something more than just your hope underpinning this?
Mr Mackay? Planning policy is generally not a matter of statute. It's generally a matter of policy. And of course there's questions around interpretation. I know that the petitioner may have a view around a statutory designation, but the planning system just doesn't work like that. The planning system is guided by a planning hierarchy, starting with the National Planning Framework 3. Now the process is a statutory one, but the policies it produces are not. Then we have Scottish planning policy, and then we have development plans. So how we arrive at that must be fully transparent and fair and robust, but it doesn't lead to statutory designations, it leads to planning policy. And what we are deploying is the same approach in this, because if you imagine every time we want to change maps or designations or any matter for consideration and taking it through primary legislation, that would just be completely disproportionate. So this government's view is this is the most proportionate and fair process to take.
Okay. Thank you.
Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener.
Good morning, gentlemen.
If I could explore further the definition of wildland and how that fits in with local authority development plans. Now, the Minister, Mr Mackay, has already touched on this. However, the draft SPP states at paragraph 129, plans should identify and safeguard areas of wildland character. This should be based on SNH mapping of core wildland published in 2013. Wildland character is displayed in some of Scotland's remoter upland, mountain and coastal areas, which are very sensitive to any form of intrusive human activity and have little or no capacity to accept new development. Can I ask the Ministers, does the draft SPP provide adequate clarity for local authorities in drawing up their development plans?
Yes, I believe it does, because that particular line isn't a major shift from the existing policy. So there is a distinction between the policies that are relevant for wind turbines and the policies that are relevant for other development. So there's considerations of both, but because there's no significant shift in the policy as it relates to other developments, I would imagine they have a degree of clarity and consistency around that. To assist with planning authorities, because they are facing some challenges right now, of course they are. There is a 20% increase in planning fees, which will lead to a better resource planning system. And we've also given one-off grants to help with the capacity of planning authorities also, both on renewables and in other areas, for example, £20,000 for Heads of Planning Scotland as well. So I am convinced that the clarity around the policy and how they approach the local development plans as it relates to development is clear and consistent. And with the extra resources, hopefully they'll have the capacity to see through some of the pressures that they face at this time. Hopefully that answers the member's question.
May I add just that the strategic development plans, and as SPP states, that strategic development plans should identify capacity for onshore wind and cumulative impact pressures, and local development plans should set out spatial frameworks. The existing SPP enables local authorities to group local designations with national and international designations as areas to be protected from wind farm development, and the approach proposed in the consultation draft SPP therefore makes it clear that local designations should not be given the same weight as national and international designations. So it does give clarity as to the hierarchy, I think, as the Minister has said.
Okay, I mean, clearly, Ministers, you believe that the guidance is adequate, but are there any plans to provide further guidance for local authorities, given that we have seen some inconsistencies throughout the country with regard to implementation to date?
Mr Mackay?
Yes, there will be guidance, of course there will, because if we amend Scottish planning policy as we propose to, and National Planning Framework 3, it will require new guidance. So there will be new guidance as a result of both documents. I think that that's necessary and helpful. That won't be the panacea for local planning authorities and every planner that will then have the magic answer to every difficult application, of course, but I think that there'll be policy clarity and there will be guidance to assist, and for that matter there has been extra resource.
I think, Convener, where I would be looking from the perspective of SNH and my side of the House would be to ensure that there's as great clarity as possible as how to interpret cumulative impact in respect to the spatial frameworks, because clearly spatial frameworks are going to be increasingly important where you're looking at Group 3 and Group 2, where there may be a potential for local authority which feels, on the basis of the evidence presented to them, that cumulative impact has reached such a point where land has to be moved into Group 2. We need to give them clarity as to how that works, so that they know, and so give clarity to the applicants as well, so they understand that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's really just to follow up on some of the questions that have already been asked by my colleagues, and that is the issue about why there seems to be an emphasis on wind turbines and not any reference to, for instance, hydro power stations, telecommunication masts, pylons, for example. We've just seen the recent developments in terms of the height of some of the pylons that are going to be strung across Scotland. My understanding is some of them are greater in height than some of the wind turbines that are going to be sited in some of the wind farms, or potentially an issue that's arising more and more often, hill tracks that are being created by landowners. So how do the Ministers tie in those types of issues with what the government are attempting to do in developing these policies and guidance to ensure that we actually, what we have is an issue that can be reflected on across many areas, rather than just what seems to appear as concentrating on wind farms or wind turbines. And I would take some exception to Jackson Carlow's definition of individual wind turbine, because I look out every morning to a wind turbine in a farm across the back from me, and when I drive up to the house, I see a wind turbine that sits there on its own, single wind turbine, that is actually viewed from miles around, and it has greater impact, visual impact, than a wind farm for many of the residents in my area.
Mr Mackay.
The government has every intention to meet our renewable energy targets and to deliver the transition to the low-carbon economy. Mr Wilson's asked why we're spending so much time on wind turbines, because you've asked us to, and because that's where there's been a number of questions and pressures around the system. Of course, Mr Wilson, like Anne McTaggart, will recall that it was only last week where I outlined the full vision of National Planning Framework and Scottish Planning Policy and covered a great deal of other issues than just renewables. Importantly, the member asks about hill tracks, because again there's a balance to be struck here between regulation or perceived over-regulation in terms of the planning system and supporting economic activity in the rural parts of Scotland. Of course, we had a consultation on that, and we came to the view that we would continue with monitoring. We would take further evidence on it. We wouldn't introduce full planning applications for every aspect of the system, but of course planning applications are required for some areas that are delivering hill tracks, but we're launching new guidance on hill tracks to make sure that they are built to an appropriate standard. So we're not closed-minded to that particular issue, although we did consult on it as part of my previous planning consultation, because there's an important balance to be struck between, again, protecting the environment, allowing agricultural and forest activity, but for many other functions, planning applications are already required.
If I could just add one thing in relation to, I think Mr Wilson raised the issue about pylons and clearly where it's possible, practical and from an environmental point of view, a sustainable thing to do, undergrounding has been sought on a number of occasions, but clearly what I would want to also say is that there's a balance that has to be struck. Sometimes it may be more appropriate to go overground than underground, where damage to peatland or other important habitats might be greater if you were to underground the cable and take out a trench full length of a cable rather than have it overground. And yes, it has a visual impact, but that's less damaging to the wider environment potentially in some cases than actually undergrounding the cable.
Ministers, for the response. Just one other question I have at the present moment, and that follows on from Angus MacDonald's question, and that is to ensure that we get consistency from local planning departments in terms of the interpretation of the designations and the guidance issued by the government, but also particularly by developers, so that they understand what the government, in terms of its siting, design or mitigation of developments, are clear in relation to what the government would wish to see in terms of any major development going ahead. Because I think it's not just planning departments, it's also the developers as well, who seem to make inappropriate demands or applications, and it's then left up to individual local authorities to make decisions based on a situation where, in many respects, despite Mr Mackay's assertion that there will be more resources for local planning departments to give better consideration to the planning applications before them, that we ensure that we actually do have a consistent approach throughout Scotland, but importantly a consistent approach from some of the developers that may come forward.
I'm not sure I would agree with the members' generalisation there. However, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, so let's pick two organisations who have commented on the policies. First of all, we have the John Muir Trust, who have said, "We're pleased that the Scottish Government now recognises the importance of wild lands, an important part of our cultural heritage and international profile." So I would say that's a welcome step in the right direction. So arguably, taking the generalisation at the other end of the spectrum from the Director of Policy for Scottish Renewables, they reported to BBC, "Onshore wind is absolutely key to meeting Scotland's climate change and renewable energy targets, and excluding large areas of the country suitable for wind farms could potentially slow progress to achieving these objectives," but then went on to say that they do appreciate that clarity is required. I would draw the member to the policies as they stand now and say that those who will, well, as they are proposed, the heads of Planning Scotland have also welcomed it. So these are the practitioners who will have to implement the policies and reflect that they are quite content with what we propose. So here we have developers, we have representatives from the environmental lobby, and we have the practitioners giving a warm welcome, if we could describe it as that, for the proposed policies going forward. That said, I can't say that there will never be local discretion or an inconsistency in the system, because different parts of Scotland have different characteristics and therefore will interpret the policies differently. It would be wrong for us in Edinburgh to try and create a formula that prejudges every single application other than the ban that we've proposed in the Group 1 and the new designation. So I can't guarantee there'll never be an inconsistency, but what there will be is clarity in policy that can then be interpreted and delivered locally. If that assists the member.
Thank you.
Very much. I'm a bit short of time, so could I have a final quick comment from Chick Brody?
Yeah, if I may just come back to the lack of definition of wild land. Can I ask, particularly Mr. Wheelhouse, last night the BBC ran yet another part of its series about the Hebrides and what's happening there in terms of introduction of wildlife. Is it okay, in your opinion, to have wild land defined, inhabited by the creatures that are inhabited, and yet have people out there grouse shooting, shooting stags, fishing, salmon fishing in particular areas? Why is that acceptable, and production of energy for a future demand not?
Well, if we take the definitions that SNH have used for building up their map, the core wildland map, it's about sort of structures rather than, you know, deer and people running around shooting deer. I take the point about, you know, the sort of, if talking about protecting the environment and the impact of sporting activities on the natural habitat. In many cases, it's essential to manage deer numbers, for example, to ensure that habitats are protected from overgrazing, which in many cases has been the cause of, we've seen recently, publication of statistics on protected features, and some of the protected features that are in most endangered are effectively overgrazed by deer or sheep, or a combination of the two. So there is obviously an impact of wildlife on our natural environment, but the definitions that SNH have used in preparing the core wildland map do not include consideration of species insofar as they're being hunted or not hunted. It's about built structures and the degree to which landscapes are impacted upon by obtrusive man-made development.
I bow to my colleagues' greater expertise in matters wildlife and rural, but I would say at the core of your question is this balance about production of energy and other forms of land use, and within that the government is very content that we can meet our renewables targets and our climate change targets, the most ambitious in the world, by affording greater protection to the quality environment that we enjoy, but also deploying policies that ensure we can meet those targets. That will include greater offshore development, for example. That will include repowering existing sites, for example. And the notion that the rest of the country would be blanketed by wind farms because of this policy is quite frankly nonsense. We will strike the right balance between protecting the environment and continuing our sustainable economic growth agenda, and in a very balanced way, getting the right developments in the right places. And clearly this is a technology that Scotland can capitalise on because of the environment we are blessed with.
Mr. Welsh, I'll give you a very quick final
very brief,
response,
just
since I mispronounced your name earlier. You do something back.
Thank you, Convener. One of the greatest threats, of course, we face in terms of our landscape is climate change. And I think it's important to get the balance, as Mr Mackay has said, in terms of ensuring that we are able to develop our renewable energy. Because if we don't, vital landscapes like South Uist and areas of the Hebrides will be potentially vulnerable to rising sea levels and some of the extreme damage we may face from climate change.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's been a very interesting session we've had with our witnesses, and I know we could have gone for a lot longer. If I could just have the witnesses to stay for a second until we look at the next stage. There has been suggestion in our recommendations that we look to referring to the Local Government Regeneration Committee, because of course they will be looking at the National Planning Framework 3 and reviewing the Scottish planning policy. But as always, this is a matter for all members of the committee, so I now seek the views of committee members on next steps. Check Brodie.
On the basis that we're all struggling to define what we're trying to do and approaching this through different frames of reference, I just wonder whether there is any other action we can take that is appropriate, that it has been aired significantly. I think all views have been thrashed out as thoroughly as we can, and I just, but dumping it on the local government and Regeneration Committee to go around the same loop, I'm not sure is the right thing.
Okay, thank you for that. John Wilson.
Commissioner, I think Chick Brodie's right. We have had an opportunity to look at the issues, and I would be minded to close the petition.
Okay. Anne McTaggart.
And likewise.
Angus MacDonald.
I think, Convener, the views of the John Muir Trust have been well aired and taken on board by a number of bodies, so I think it would be fair enough to close the petition.
Jim Eadie.
I think, Convener, on this occasion, as a substitute member of the committee, I'll defer to colleagues who have considered this issue in greater depth than I have.
Jackson Carlo.
I think since ministers have set their face against the design of the petitioner to move this into statute, then there is little more that this petitions committee can do. I accept the issues have been well aired, and I think that the debate moves elsewhere now.
Okay. Well, I think the view overall of the committee is clear that we need to close the petition, not because we're not interested, but because it's quite clear what the government's position is. But could I thank the John Muir Trust for the petition, particularly Helen McDade, who's done a lot of hard work on this particular issue. I think the committee's learned a lot about the quite technical details here. And I would also like to thank our witnesses today for coming along. It's been very useful. This is quite a difficult area of work, but I think you have performed well going through your paces, as Jackson Carlo said earlier. But this will run and run in the long term. And thank you all for coming along, and I appreciate your time. And I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to change. Thank you again, gentlemen, for coming along. To restart our committee, and we're now on agenda item 3, consideration of new petitions. The next item for business is consideration of new petitions. There are 2 new petitions for consideration today, and as previously agreed, the committee has invited the petitioners to speak in both of them. The first new petition is PE 1478 by Murray Cooper on the A90 Balmeedy to Tipperty dualling project. Members have a note by the clerk. Paper 3 refers to spice briefing and petition. Could I welcome the petitioner, Mary Cooper? You're very welcome, Mr Cooper. Thank you for coming along. I'll ask you to make a short statement of around 5 minutes, and then I'll ask my colleagues, including myself, to provide some questions before we decide the next course of action. Mr Cooper.
All right, thank you. Morning, everybody. I'm not here today to argue the case for the upgrading of the 11-kilometre section of the A90, or that it is urgently required, because that's a fact that's universally agreed and accepted. That's why the Scottish Government has already planned it, designed it, consulted and had it all in hand to start work in 2009 to be completed in 2013. Unfortunately, or what I should say is, even in the Transport Scotland's website, they said the improvements will provide continuous dual carriageway between Aberdeen and Ellen, which will remove the bottleneck that is caused by the single carriageway that has caused the local community much distress and has been pressing for this upgrade for a number of years. So the main points, as I see them anyway, the case is clear, the road is required, it's designed, it's approved, and it's on track, and that's where we were in 2009. Unfortunately, in 2011, or maybe unfortunately is a bit unfair at that time, but somebody in 2011 decided to merge that project with the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, which was probably a good idea at the time based on potential cost savings of combining the two projects. But the key statement in there is, was a good idea. At that time, RoadSense had not begun its relentless legal challenges. They then did, and unfortunately both projects were delayed. However, despite asking on several occasions from my local MSPs and the ministers as to some explanation as to why the project should remain combined, we've never had any reasonable explanation as to the justification for that. As you'll be aware, eventually the legal challenges came to an end, and a timeline has been developed by the government regarding the development of the roads, both the AWPR and the Balmeedy to Tipperty section. They're out to tender in spring 2013 with award in autumn 2014, and with the project being completed in 2018. But within this timeline, there is no clarity on when the Balmeedy to Tipperty section will be completed. However, based on the information that is available to the public, it's likely that it's not going to be before 2016, but it could be as late as 2018. You'll be aware via the petition that I submitted some of the questions that I asked various MSPs and government departments, and didn't really get many answers to any of the questions that were asked. The things that I would like to have considered as part of this discussion is that the A90 north of Aberdeen is the only transport route for the people in the north east of Scotland. We do not have a rail link, we do not have an alternative A-class road. This road is it. Peterhead, Fraserburgh and Ellen are the largest, second largest and sixth largest towns in Aberdeenshire, and this road is estimated to support around 80,000 people commuting into the Aberdeen area. Peterhead, as you're aware, is a major oil and gas services port. Peterhead and Fraserburgh account for 45% of all the fish landings in the UK. All of that produce has to travel along that road, as does all the produce from the local farming communities and any other industry. The main hospital for the area is the ARI in Aberdeen, so anybody that's suffering from an emergency, a long-term illness, has to travel along the same route. There is a large population base commuting from these towns and surrounding areas to Aberdeen day to day for work, and they have no other option. Even the public transport has to use the same section of road. The local park and ride comes out of the car park and goes on to this section of road that has not been upgraded. I did have a list of questions for you guys to maybe consider, but the key thing is, in conclusion, that in my view, unless there's a clear commitment made to deliver the upgrade to this section of road in line with the original promise, it seems that the long-suffering, hard-working people of the north east of Scotland will remain in daily traffic jams to get to their employment, their customers, their health services or their education services for many years to come. It seems that there is a view that we should be happy to wait until 2018 to see any improvements to what is clearly some of the poorest infrastructure in Scotland, because somebody somewhere has decided without reasonable explanation that this is right. Surely this is not something that is acceptable to the Parliament. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mr Cooper. I think you make a very strong, compelling case there, and I can see the great frustration that your fellow people who live in the same communities you must suffer day in and day out. It's easy to go back in time and rewrite history, but do you think going back in time it was a mistake to link it to the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route development? Because obviously the legal challenge wasn't the fault of the Scottish Government,
no,
that was done by someone independently. But do you think that has caused the main delay in this project?
I think subsequently to the legal challenge, it has caused the main delay. I don't think it was a bad idea. I'm an operations manager in a FTSE 100 oil service company. I know about making tough decisions and all of these things, but there's also the ability to go back and review what you've done and decide if it's still the right course of action.
I mean, is your take on this now, is it possible, do you think, that it could be disconnected from the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route project at this late stage? Do you think that is possible?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just whether the will is there. Or anything is possible. I mean, the questions that I've asked that were part of the petition, nobody's explained in detail why it was the right decision in the first place. I've made my own assumptions around cost and all of these things, which I think were appropriate, but nobody's ever documented what savings were going to be made versus the cost of the delay.
And do you have questions that are separate and independent from the petition? Because obviously we've got the petition and we would normally, or on many occasions, send that to the Scottish Government for comment. If you've got questions that are not on the petition, we'd certainly welcome that, and if you can give that to the clerk, we would, I'm sure the committee members would want the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland to have some observation and some comments back.
Yeah, they're more a reiteration of the specific questions that I sent in the original letter to the Transport Minister regarding how the decision was made, what data set was used to make the decision, is the decision still valid, are there alternative options to be looked at, even within the combined scheme, are there clever things that they could do in the tendering to try and accelerate and commit to early delivery of certain parts of the project. Yeah,
right, well that all seems very sensible to me. Can I throw them then to other committee members for comments or points? Certainly my instincts at this stage is to ask the Scottish Government / Transport Scotland to ask for the views on Mr Cooper's petition and get an answer to all these questions, but obviously committee members may have other views. Chip Brodie?
Well, I think you've covered most of it, Convener. I mean, while I have some sympathy, I mean the petition as it stands, we know this is not going to happen by mid-2014, which is what the petition asks for. So therefore, on that basis, I think the petition falls. I mean, there's no harm in asking for further clarification. I'm sure there must be some very good, not just cost reasons, but construction reasons as to why it was bundled with AWPR. And we know what happened to that, don't we?
Thank you for that. Other members? Remember to be, notwithstanding Chick's point, I do understand the actual practicality. Sorry, I'll bring in John Wilson first before.
Convener, if we're going to write to Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government, could I also, and because the note we have in front of us is quite clear, this road, as well as the peripheral route around Aberdeen, is currently out for tender. And it would be useful to ask Aberdeen City Council, as the managing agent for the contract, as to whether or not there would be any problems separating out the contracts or the type of timescale that they're looking to put out to tender, because effectively what the government have done and Transport Scotland have done is handed this over to Aberdeen City Council to actually try and progress it. Now, as I understand it, it's currently out for tender, and it would be interesting to find out whether or not in the tender, without having to rewrite the tender, whether or not it would be possible to bring in some of the work and phased work in a time scale that would be more appropriate to the petitioner.
Are members agreeable with John Wilson's suggestion?
Yeah, I think it's important, Convener, that we do keep the petition open to be clarified with Aberdeen City Council, as the member has mentioned, Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government, to ask them the questions that obviously the petitioner has brought to us today.
Thank you for that. Does any other member have any other comment before we can conclude? So I think then we'll continue the petition to seek advice information from Transport Scotland, the Scottish Government and Aberdeen City Council, was John Wilson's point. And obviously we'll keep in touch through the clerks and let you know the developments. And thanks for travelling through and taking the time out of your busy job to put this petition in person today. I appreciate your time today, and we'll obviously keep you up to date with developments, Mr Cooper.
All right, thank you. Thanks for your time. Cheers.
Thank you. Mr Spen for 1 minute. Restart the committee. We're on the second new petition is PE 1479 by Andrew Muir on complaints about solicitors. Members have a note by the clerk, it's paper 4, the spice briefing on the petition. Jackie Bailey, who's Mr Muir's constituency MP, MSP, sorry, hoped to come along today, but I think she has got shadow cabinet, so it's probably unlikely she'll be at this actual timing. So perhaps just put that on the record. Could I welcome the petitioner, Mr Muir? Thank you for coming along, Mr Muir. And can I ask you to make a short statement of around 5 minutes before we throw the petition open for questions? Mr Muir.
Hello, my name is Andrew Muir. Thank you for allowing me to speak. In the run-up to the independence referendum, I'm trying to make Scotland a fairer and nicer place to live in and to make services more accountable. This is the point of this petition and also my previous petition about the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, which I spoke to this committee about last year. The legal profession is very powerful in Scotland. Members can be very highly paid. Given their importance, it is essential that they come under the highest possible scrutiny and accountability. It's ridiculous that complaints can only be made within 1 year of an event happening. I would like to briefly share my complaint experiences. The limited review of the 2003 Mental Health Act was presented to Scottish ministers in March 2009. On page 41, it states that a major issue concerning mental health tribunals was the availability, quality and style of legal representation. On page 43, it states the quality of legal representation is poor. Unfortunately, nothing has changed to correct these matters since 2009. My wife was put under compulsory treatment for 15 months under the Mental Health Act and was given a solicitor from a very limited choice to represent her at mental health tribunals. To our horror, her solicitor in a Kafkaesque situation actually worked for the other side at these mental health tribunals by making several false statements. The solicitor was paid legal aid by the taxpayer but was worse than useless. She failed to point out serious procedural omissions when my wife's liberty and right to refuse treatment was at stake, hardly a robust safeguard intended by the Mental Health Act. After I'd complained to the Health Board, the Ombudsman and several other parties about other matters, I then complained to the Law Society about this some 15 months after my wife's treatment ended.
Sorry, Mr Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt in your presentation. It would be really useful if you could just focus on the sort of bigger issue about the petition, how it affects people throughout Scotland. I obviously appreciate your wife's situation is very pertinent to you. It causes some difficulty for the committee if we're focusing on one individual rather than the wider issue. If it's possible to maybe editorialise your comments.
I was going to talk about how we went to court and how that never worked out. Would that be of any interest? Because the alternative
that still is this, yeah, that still comes into the same problem. It's the wider issue we're looking at. It's just that we've got some constraints on the committee in what we can and can't hear about court cases, even though they've now been dealt with.
Well, I was just going to say that we went to court and because of the Scottish legal system, it didn't work, and that makes it even more important that there's no time bar on complaints. Now, whether you want to just take a transcript of my speech and read it yourself, or it's really about why the court case never worked out. What would you like to do?
Yeah. It's the basically the advice I'm being given is we really need to hear about the wider issues affecting people in Scotland about your petition. It's complaints against solicitors. I'm sorry, it must be very painful, the issue about your wife. It's just that causes us some constraints on procedures. That's the reason I'm pulling you up. So I'm sorry interrupting your points. Have you any other points that you may wish to make in summary?
Just like to say that you can't complain in court either due to the Scottish court, although in an English court you probably could. There's subtle differences, and that makes it a problem in the Scottish justice system. So I'd say, although the Scottish justice is called distinctive by some commentators, I would call it unfair and unaffordable, and the removal of this time bar would help redress the balance a little. So I'll leave it there and I'll miss out my second page.
Okay, and I'm sorry again, Mr Muir, for interrupting you. I'm sure you appreciate the constraints I'm operating under as well. Thank you very much for your understanding. Can I throw open to committee members for sort of comment? Can I start, Mr Brodie?
Good morning, Mr Muir. In the advice that we've been given, in terms of they're saying a complaint will not be accepted unless the Commission considers that the circumstances are exceptional. Did they give you any indication as to what the exceptional circumstances might be?
No, they just said they weren't going to deal with it. There was no indication at all.
So that was it?
Yeah.
Just, we're not going to deal with it?
Yeah, we're just not going to deal with it. I asked, once I got the tribunal transcript, I tried again. After the court case, I tried again. They just carried on with the 1 year time ban and said we're not dealing with it.
And was there any guidance given as to what, I don't know why, maybe I should have understood this better, but why this limitation of they will not accept a complaint after 1 year?
Well, they seem to think you'll have all the evidence available before 1 year. You'll know exactly what you're doing. There's no constraints on you. Everything's there. But it doesn't work like that in practice.
That doesn't work like that in practice from either side, of course.
Well, from our point of view...
So, in terms of, and I have some experience of this, having been to the Law Society myself, is they're saying that they can't accept a complaint if it's after 1 year. Have you any circumstances where a lawyer has not been able to respond and yet their complaint or their evidence can be given after 1 year?
I don't know anything about that.
So there's no fairness, is there?
I just know that other, as I say, I was talking about the Jimmy Savile and things can go on 40 years. Because there's such a big barrier in getting information and getting people to do things, 1 year's nothing.
With absolutely no explanation?
No explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brody. Other members of the committee wish to ask any comments or questions? Alma Taggart.
Thanks, Convener. I had noted, Mr Muir, that the Justice Committee have contacted the Cabinet Secretary, but they're awaiting, as of yet, the response. Have you received a response?
No, there's been no. I've seen that on the website as well, but yeah. I'm in the dark. Nothing to me at all whatsoever.
Okay.
Other members of the committee wish to comment? Okay. Well, sorry. Yes, Jim Eadie.
Do you think that there should be a time bar? In which case, what would be a reasonable time limit, or do you think that there should be no limit of time?
Well, I don't think there should be any, because people are talking about 3 years, 5 years. I'm 7 years on now, and say Jimmy Savile and other things are 40 years in the Catholic Church. You can go on. It just there's such a barrier, which I was trying to explain in the rest of my speech, in anything.
So do you think there should be a time bar?
No, no, none whatsoever.
Thank you.
Mr. Brody?
Yeah, can I just coming back to the SLCC, did you deal with one person in the Commission or a series of people?
I never heard of these organisations when I complained. They expected me to know all about them, and they expected me to know the 1 year old, the 2 year old. I first went to the Law Society because that's what it was in 2009, and they looked at it, and then they passed me on to the SLCC, and a separate person looked at it, and they both said the same answer. No, we're not looking at it.
Any further questions to our witness? Jim Eadie, do you wish?
I'm just going to... I know we're not under the procedures able to get into in any detail to your wife's circumstances, but given that this impinges on wider issues of mental health, have you approached any of the mental health charities or organisations for a view on the wider issues?
Approached the Mental Welfare Commission. They said, well, a lawyer making up that? Oh, it wouldn't happen in practice, and not interested. They just couldn't believe it. And do you speak to any of the charities? Not really charities. I've been down all the other complaints, the Ombudsman, my local council, the Health Board, and about 10 people of the police, but not a charity as such, no. Okay.
Our next step, Mr Muir, is looking at how we then deal with the committee, and we always ask witnesses to stay in for that, so it's a very open and transparent situation. There's certainly an argument, I think, for asking the Scottish Government, Scottish Legal Complaints Committee and the Law Society for the views on the petition, but again, I'd like to get the views of committee members on whether that's an appropriate next step.
I think it is. I have to say, maybe this isn't the right place. I get kind of frustrated that some people in the legal profession feel that they are a sector apart from the society, and we've already had another conversation with another individual about not being at this committee. They are not, and I think in the strongest possible terms we should say we're seeking information from the government, the SLCC and the Law Society as to what their actual process and approach is. I'd also like to understand why, if there was supposed to be an update on this process by Wednesday the 22nd of May, and yet as of the 21st of May there's been no response. So I'd actually like to ask the government why.
Okay, thank you for that. Anne McTaggart.
And also, taking my colleague Jim Eadie's point, I think I would be keen to ask the mental health charities and some of the mental health organisations just exactly what their view within this is, because obviously it's not just a one person that it affects.
Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I also note that the SLCC itself has suggested to the Scottish Government that the Act needs to be reviewed. So it would be good to see what the Scottish Government's views are on that.
Yeah, and they're a comparatively new body, aren't they? So it'd be interesting to see their views. Okay. Are members agreeable with the approach that other members? Sorry, Jackson Carroll?
I'm happy to go along with that approach. I do myself feel that given that the Justice Committee is carrying out post-legislative scrutiny and that this is a highly personalised example of the issues arising, that I would myself have recommended that, unusually on this occasion, we refer the petition to the Justice Committee in the light of the post-legislative scrutiny they're undertaking. But I'm happy to go along with the broader views of
and
members.
certainly think we shouldn't rule that out once this comes back at a future date, once we get the material back. So I take Jackson Carroll's point, and certainly something we bear in mind for next time round.
Can I just say, in the letter from the Director of Law Reform that we received from Law Society, the comment that if the petitioner has not done so already, he may want to seek legal advice about the exercise of this discretion by the Commission. My experience is, it goes around this little pool of legal advisors, solicitors, what have you, with absolutely no determination at all, because it is almost like a closed sect. And going forward, that has to stop. If we want a fair and open society, they have to play the game like everybody else.
Thank you for that, Mr. Burry. In summary then, the committee is obviously very keen to take your petition on to seek advice for the various organisations that we've mentioned and various members have mentioned, and obviously the clerks will keep you up to date with the developments, Mr. Burry. Thanks again for coming along and giving evidence, and sorry we had to cut you off on a purely procedure point, but thanks very much for your time, and I suspend for 1 minute to allow Mr. Muir to leave. Thank you. By Margaret Forbes on behalf of the Scottish Women Against Pornography on the display of sexually graphic magazines and newspapers. Members, a note by the clerk, it's paper 5. And just before I invite contributions to members, just to remind members, particularly Jim Eady, who's obviously just his first committee today, that we were involved with this particular issue some time ago, and I think went into a lot of detail. It's obviously a very, I think, a very relevant, very pertinent petition. It was then referred to our Equal Opportunities Committee. It's been referred back to us, which I have to say is probably quite an unusual step. And the other issue that members should know is that the National Federation of Retail News have published guidance to newsagents throughout Scotland on this particular issue as well. My particular feeling is that I don't see any further mileage for this committee on this particular petition, and would recommend to members that we close the petition, not because it's not got value, but we have actually dealt with this in quite a lot of detail. I just don't see a window of opportunities for doing anything further on this particular petition. Can I throw open for thoughts to members?
I get, having been involved in companies across Europe for a long time, I understand, I try to understand the basis of the petition, but we have this almost obsession with this type of thing when, there's accessibility on the internet, why is it just women? I mean, there are men's magazines. I mean, we've looked at it 13 occasions. I think I agree with you, we should close it.
Are members agreeable, or is there a contrary view? Anne McTaggart?
For all the reasons that you've mentioned, and that the Equal Opportunity Committee has also decided that no further action is necessary at this time, so they also have a view on it, and I think it should be closed.
But now, obviously, we would like to thank Margaret Forbes for her efforts putting this forward.
Certainly.
If we could just make that note of that. Thank you. The second current petition we've got today is PE 1421 by Gail Robertson on behalf of the Outer Hebrides Transport Group on fair ferry fares. Members have a note by the clerk's paper 6 and submissions. and could just record that Rhoda Grant would have wanted to be here today, but she's actually travelling to Edinburgh as we speak and not able to attend. Obviously, we've had quite a lot of issues around Western Isles. As you recall, we had our Parliament Day in Western Isles, and there was a number of transport issues there. I think there's an argument, and I think Angus MacDonald will probably agree with me in this, that it might be useful to get the leader of Western Isles Council, Angus Campbell, to come along and speak to us directly about this particular issue. And we can maybe tie in some of the other issues that are pertinent to this, such as PSOs for the services to Benecula and Barra as well. There seems to be quite a few, and indeed Wi-Fi, so there's actually 3 different issues affecting Western Isles. Again, Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Yeah, I would agree. I think it is an opportune moment, given that there are 3 petitions currently live at committee, referring directly to the Western Isles. And on this one in particular, I have to say, having been in Stornoway as recently as yesterday, there's still a general consensus that the benefits of RET have not been passed on to the general public by local hauliers. However, as you know, there was a debate last week in Parliament, and I'm pleased to see the working group being established, which will continue a broad representation, which will contain a broad representation of key stakeholders. I've actually read the report on the removal of RET from commercial vehicles, and the report does point out that it was hard to assess the impact of the removal of RET against the general economic slowdown, with a 16% increase in haulage costs between 2008 and 2012, mainly due to fuel price increases. So it would be good to get the leader of the council, and perhaps the convener of the council, if he's available, to give evidence on this specific issue.
Are members agreeable with that course of action? Everyone agreeable? Agreed. Thank you very much for that. So obviously we're continuing this petition, and we're going to ask the leader and convener of Western Isles to come along and provide evidence to us on a trilogy of these transport issues. That's the right term. The third current petition is PE 1431 by Nick Rutherford on behalf of the Fair Isle community on a marine protected area for Fair Isle. Members for a note by the clerk and submissions. You recall that this is some time ago now we had evidence. I think this is a very interesting petition. I think there is still some issues around the fishing community there, which is very understandable. But there still appears to be some delays getting some resolution from Marine Scotland, and I would certainly suggest that we either have Marine Scotland in, or that we write to them and ask when they're going to be able to clarify the outcome of the final assessment of the demonstration and research proposals will be published. We've been given quite a few promises in this, and this is crucial to the next steps. So I'm relaxed about whether they're here in person or whether we just get some submission in writing, but I'd seek again the views of committee members on the next steps.
Well, I agree. I actually think we should have them here.
Okay. Are members agreeable we have Marine Scotland? Jackson? Carlo?
I am. I think that we should say that we note the various times that they've said this information will be available. We expect them to hold to their publication over the summer, and that we look forward to then quizzing them on the report in person here at the beginning of the new parliamentary session.
Are members all happy with that approach? Okay, thank you for that. If I move to our fourth current petitions, it's PE 1463 by Sandra White, Marion Dyer and Lorraine Cleaver on effective thyroid and adrenal testing, diagnosis and treatment. I think the petitioners are in the gallery, if I've got my right glasses on. If I've not, I'm sorry. And we've got Elaine Smith in attendance for this petition. And I know Elaine Smith's got a lot of expertise in this particular area and would like to make some brief opening remarks to the committee. Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, Convener. The petitioners are indeed in the gallery. Since I was last here, the committee have received evidence from endocrinologists and others, which I believe does highlight an urgent need for a review into the way thyroid patients are diagnosed and treated and dealt with by healthcare professionals in the UK. As the committee will have read the evidence, and there's a lot of it, I'm only going to pick out one or two remarks in these opening remarks. Before I do that, though, could I just highlight for the committee a life-threatening situation that patients are in at present, and it's fortuitous that the committee is in the process of dealing with this issue because the sole pharmaceutical firm manufacturing T3 in the UK has stopped production as of, well, people have found out about it just at the end of last week. That's raised a number of questions. For example, why was Mercury Pharma the only supplier? And there are questions around price as well of T3. They were charging over £50 for a month's supply when in other parts of the world it's £1 for 100. So these are issues, but the most pressing issue at the moment is the fact that people, mainly women as we know, could actually die if they can't get T3, and it's akin to diabetics not getting insulin. So we would all be grateful if there's any action that the committee can take to help that situation. I've raised it with the Health Minister, and I've had some other MSPs contacting me because constituents have contacted them about it. And that then leads me into a comment that you received in your information from Dr Henry Lindner, who said that he believes the failures that he'd outlined with regard to diagnosis and treatment would have been identified and corrected if not for, and I'm quoting him from your papers, the pervasive influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Now that might of course also have a bearing on the fact that GPs who prescribe natural thyroid extract are being reported even though their patients respond well. You've had some information about that as well. And doctors then feel constrained because if they prescribe natural thyroid extract, some of them are getting dragged in front of the Royal College of Physicians, which really is quite appalling because their patients are getting better. In our submission that you received from Dr McLean, this is actually the one where he talks about, Dr McLean talks about the Department of Health in America and the fines to pharmaceutical companies. He basically says in that submission that because the natural thyroid is natural, it can't be patented, which then means that obviously there's no funding in that paper from Dr McLean. Sorry, there's no funding in that particular item because of that. So I think it's also interesting to note that the MHRA have just issued a statement where they're saying now with regard to the T3 situation, doctors now need to source unlicensed T3 from elsewhere. But if you put that back to the evidence you've received, you've got doctors being hounded by the establishment when they prescribe desiccated thyroid hormone, which is bringing their patients back to life. So it's a bit ironic that because the one manufacturer has stopped making T3, we're now being told that prescribers need to source unlicensed T3. In your papers as well, Dr Soyberg points out there are no clinical trials comparing patients on synthetic thyroxine with natural desiccated thyroid, even though that was the treatment right up until the drug companies began producing the synthetic pills. So I would say, Convener, the evidence you've received so far from the medical people that you've contacted does point to an urgent need for a review in the way that patients are dealt with. If I'm right, you've not yet had a reply from the Royal College of Physicians, I don't think. But their guidance only covers people who can convert normally, which levothyroxine might help them. In fact, Dr Toft on the STV News last night said that as well, but not others. And the reason others might not complain is, and again you have it in your paperwork, that blood tests will show that supposedly the thyroid levels are okay, but they'll be suffering maybe from things like fibromyalgia, they'll be diagnosed with ME, so they'll not complain about their thyroid because they'll not realise that that's possibly what's causing their other issues, as happened with myself actually. So to summarise some of the evidence you have, 103,000 people have been diagnosed with hypothyroidism in Scotland, and it's been estimated that actually that only makes up about 20% of people who have it, who've actually been diagnosed, and for every man it affects 10 women. It doesn't seem to be an NHS issue as such, but it may be training from the Royal College of Physicians that filters down, and that results in doctors' hands being tied. So I think it's unfortunate that you've not had any response as yet from them. And Dr Toft, again, just to quote him, is clear that doctors need to take a holistic approach to the issue to look for signs and symptoms that show there's conversion failure. Things are slow in the States, but they're making progress, and they've narrowed the reference range. Again, you have that in your papers, and they're again looking at that. And Thyroid Change, an organisation that the petitioners are in touch with, is in contact with people in 147 different countries. So I think that gives you some idea about the disorder. I think it's something of an epidemic, and it could provide a key to other problems like obesity and heart conditions. Can I just come to a conclusion here by quoting the petitioners who say in their submission to you that they may only be 3 anecdotes who almost died. I could add myself to that and make it 4. But they speak for a worldwide thyroid community, and they have the support of doctors who are world authorities on the speciality. Now, the Scottish Government intervention is extremely welcome. You've had a letter from them, but they are only going to be reviewing the paperwork, and they're proposing to look at diagnosis and treatment across the rest of the UK. But if you look abroad to places like the US, to Cuba, to Germany, you may find that to be more helpful. They're also proposing about 6 months to get back to you, but meanwhile, women are suffering and some people may actually be dying. So I think committee members recognised that the last time, and some of the members said that a short timescale for action was necessary. So if I could perhaps ask that the committee consider doing some work, speaking to people rather than reviewing paperwork while the government's gathering in the paperwork from the establishment. Obviously, there's an option for the committee to consider taking evidence to appoint an advisor, but there's short timescales now till the summer recess, convener. Perhaps you might consider the option of a round table discussion where you could speak to people. You could speak to maybe folk like Lynn Minot, for instance, who was interviewed last night, or Margaret McGregor, who runs the helpline in Scotland and deals with people, some of the GPs who've been prescribing desiccated thyroid and how that impacts on their patients. So that might help in the meantime to get a little bit more information while you're waiting on the government to come back to you in the 6 months it's going to take. The Equal Opportunities Committee, when I was on it myself, did something similar where they took some evidence while the government was also looking at an issue of women in prison. So can I just say, convener, whatever you decide to do, I would like to thank your committee very much for raising the profile of this issue and getting commitment to action, which might yet mean that Scotland can become a world leader in the field and that lives could be saved. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, very much for our eloquent sort of summary of the issues and giving us some tips for the future. Just to point out to members, some of the reference that Elaine Smith was rightly making does refer to previous papers. There were papers that are not in front of you today, so just in case members are looking a little bit confused about where the references came from, they were from the original paper we had, but we haven't got all that in front of us. So there is a suggestion that we have a round table event which would obviously be timed to be before the 6 months is up, because that's when the government's going to get back to us. In terms of timing, I just advise the committee, unfortunately, we're not able to do that before the summer recess because our slots are all unfortunately filled up with other petitions until then. But it may be possible, and I'd have to speak to the clerk about this, that we could do something after the summer, as early as possible. But again, can I throw it open to members? There's a variety of options we can look at. We can obviously invite Alec Neil, the Minister, to come along. We can defer until we've had the Scottish Government response back, or we could do something more proactive, which is actually have a round table with key individuals who've got a lot of knowledge in this subject, including patients, obviously. John Wilson?
Yeah, taking on board many of the points that Elaine Smith has outlined this morning and the submission that we've had from the petitioners, I think the idea of having a round table is useful, but given the constraints that you've indicated in terms of timing, I would be keen to see if it would be possible to invite the Cabinet Secretary for Health along to a meeting prior to the summer recess, because the petitioners and Elaine Smith have highlighted a serious situation where the standard drug that's been given to many of the patients has now effectively been withdrawn. And it would be useful if we could get some assurances from the Cabinet Secretary for Health as to the impact and implications that the withdrawal by the manufacturer of that drug is having on many of the patients throughout Scotland. Because clearly, as the petitioners have indicated and Elaine Smith, this is a life-threatening situation that we're in. And to find that a drug company has withdrawn in April of this year a drug that is crucial to the well-being and health of many of the patients who are receiving, and potential patients receiving that drug, then clearly there are answers that need to be given, and not after the summer recess. We need to get those answers now, because as quite clearly identified by the petitioners last night on the news bulletins, this is a serious situation that we're in. And it's to get to the stage where we are at the present moment, clearly does not address the seriousness of the issues faced by many of these patients, and we need to get answers as quickly as possible. And I'd like to personally see the Cabinet Secretary for Health at a committee, and we find half an hour in our committee slot, before the summer recess, to invite him along here, along with his officials, to get answers to the questions that need to be asked of the Cabinet Secretary as to why we now find ourselves in the situation that we're in.
Thank you for that. Just again, on the practicalities, obviously the future committees up until recess are busy. The clerk tells me it's not impossible that we can't reschedule, but obviously we need to do a little bit of work on that. So if you bear with us a bit, we'll see what work we can do to achieve John Wilson's objective. Chip Brodie? Sorry, can I bring in Jim Eadie first and then Chip? Right, Chip Brodie.
Just on that latter point, I know we're all very busy, but I echo what John Wilson says, and somehow whether we reschedule or whether we add time or find other time, then I did what Elaine suggested we do. I have secretarial support of a company in Ayr, and the lady who runs it actually suffered from this condition. I'm surprised and distraught that the supplier has withdrawn the T3 medicine. I do think we should bring the Cabinet Secretary. I know he's wrestling with trying to get the process of orphan drugs and things like that, but we really have to get a standard process that makes sure that we've got good clinical advice, that the appropriate drugs are available as defined, and make sure that process works. In this case, I would suggest that we find the time to discuss this and certainly ask the Cabinet Secretary to attend a meeting as early as possible.
Right, thanks for that. Other members? Jim Eadie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I would just fully support and endorse what's been said by Elaine Smith, John Wilson and Chick Brodie on in terms of the roundtable discussion. I think that is certainly something that should happen in terms of considering the wider issues, but there's the more urgent issue of the supply of the T3 treatment and the fact that the sole manufacturer has ceased production since April. So I would very much support having the Cabinet Secretary in front of the committee before the summer recess, and I think that we should juggle our timescales to ensure that happens. And that is a very narrow issue about the production and supply of the life sustaining treatment that hasn't previously been available. I think the wider issues about access to medicines and how we ensure that the system makes appropriate treatments available is for the roundtable discussion, and the wider issues of proper diagnosis, because I think Elaine Smith rightly referred to the fact that there may be an epidemic within the wider population that is as yet undiagnosed. And I was also very interested reading the papers for today's meeting, the statement from the Royal College of Physicians that they do not support the use of T3 or thyroid extracts without further validated research published in peer-reviewed journals. I'm just wondering, it'd be useful to have them at the round table to explore that issue with them and with the regulatory body, the MHRA, who clearly have considered the safety, quality and efficacy of the licensed treatment, to have their views on that, and also their views on unlicensed treatments which clinicians are now being advised to make available.
Thanks for that. Angus MacDonald?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yeah, there's definitely a very strong argument to invite the Cabinet Secretary to committee prior to the recess, so I'm happy to concur with everyone on that. With regards to round tables, I've found round tables extremely informative on other committees that I've served on, and would certainly agree that the RCP should also be invited to attend that.
Ahmed Taggart.
Just really to agree with all that's said, and thank Elaine Smith for bringing that to our attention. I think it's more urgent than what even Elaine Smith has suggested. I do think that we need to speak to the Cabinet Secretary before we finish up for recess.
Final point,
presumably the T3 drug went through the usual process, the SMC and things like that.
The T3, as far as I can find out, the reason that we're only finding out recently is the production stopped in April, but I had found out before that that L-troxin, which is it's supposed to be the best form of thyroxine, it's the named drug L-troxin, it had become difficult to get. That was the start of the problems with Mercury Pharma in April. But we only found out just recently that it was T3 as well. And then on that, it was discovered by people who were on it that they were the only manufacturers for the whole of the UK. So basically women, it's mainly women that I know about, have been scrambling around just now, giving each other pills. People don't stockpile these things, they've got a date as well. So they've been giving each other pills to help each other out, to see if it can be, to help each other out while it's being explored. So yes, it was the licensed product. What I find surprising is there was only one manufacturer of it, and the price of the product when you compare it. I understand that some people have been recommended to get some from abroad. I'm also told that the potency of it might have been difficult as well recently, with some people who are on T3 feeling unwell and not understanding why they've been feeling not quite well. So there's all of that. So it was the licensed product, but the MHRA on their website, I've got a copy here, are now saying that prescribers through their chemists should be looking to getting unlicensed products to fill the need. So it's not so much that the company manufacturing it have withdrawn. I think there may also be problems with that company with other medicines. They seem to just have stopped manufacturing certain medicines, and I'm not clear why.
Just on that, the wider reason I asked the question, if it is a licensed product, is deeply disconcerting. It's very important in this case, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if there's a hole in the process where a manufacturer, pharmaceutical manufacturer, gets into trouble and then says, right, I'm going to withdraw this product because it's too expensive to make or too difficult to distribute, then we have a potentially a big problem. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think we with the Cabinet Secretary here and indeed the round table, we can explore this whole process, because we seem to be running into these problems on a very regular basis, and I'd like to understand exactly what SMC, the clinicians do, the SMC does, not just in licensing products, but making sure that they don't fall out of the supply chain.
Jimmy, did you go back?
I just wanted to ask, have the committee written to the manufacturer and also to the MHRA?
No. Can
we do that?
No.
As an action to these meetings?
I think that's something we should action as well, Mr. Reid. Can I just confirm, Ellen Smith, you said in your opening remarks, could you just confirm, do the company that did produce the T3, do they have any exclusive rights over this drug? Because you were saying there was some issue around exclusivity.
Well, they seem to be the only ones who are producing it. I can only give you anecdotally from my own chemist, who I happen to know, who was trying to get this. And he said that Pfizer produce a form of T3, so he thought he could maybe source it from Pfizer under a patented name. Sorry, I've forgotten the name. Cimarol, I think. But when he went to Pfizer, he discovered they're only selling it out with the UK, that they were not licensed to sell it in the UK. But I don't know the ins and outs of that. But I do know that this is the only company who are, and it tells you that on the MHRA website, that they're the only company who are licensed to supply T3 in the UK.
I mean, we won't get too technical, but obviously, as other members have pointed out, I mean, we can check with NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and the Scottish Medicines Consortium, which are the approval process for drugs in the UK. We can
need to be clear that the licensing authority in the UK, but this is very much a reserved matter. The licensing authority in the UK is the MHRA. There are different assessment processes in other parts of the UK when it comes to the cost effectiveness and clinical effectiveness of new treatments. I think we do need to distinguish between the two.
And even, again, picking up Mr. Reid, things we've done at other, other evidence sessions, even individual health boards have individual approval processes. This is quite a complicated area.
Complex.
But the key point that coming through from members, this is urgent, that we want to see the Minister as soon as possible. That may need to involve some rescheduling, and we will get back to you at a later date on that. And I think members are also saying, let's do a round table. That will be after the summer recess, involving the groups that members have mentioned. Is that a fair summary of?
Can I just on that? I think it's good that Jim Eadie is here because of his experience. It'd be helpful. I would certainly find it helpful to have a look at what we think the process is in terms of approving licensed products, and also what role each of the bodies involved actually plays in that, both in terms of the reserved matter and our local responsibility.
And I think you've just predicted the first questions to the Minister when Neil comes along.
I think
but
if
I'm
we
sure,
had it before
yes,
then, that would help.
We'll do our best to get that information to you, Brody, before that. John Wilson?
I can think of a number of first questions to the Cabinet Secretary when it comes along here, and it's not just about the licensing of particular drugs. I think the issue here, and quite clearly identified, is for patients who are currently being denied access to a drug that basically is assisting them and is life-saving at the present time. I think that's the questions that we need to start asking the Cabinet Secretary. The cost factor, and I think Elaine Smith quite clearly in the petitioners highlighted the situation for at the present moment for a licensed drug to be able to charge 5,000% above what the charges are in the rest of Europe and throughout the world raises serious questions about the licensing process.
I don't think we're getting well enough informed about these issues to make.
Yes.
We're speculating here, and I think we do need...
Just to clarify for Mr Reid's benefit, and given his previous experience prior to entering Parliament, the evidence we have been presented with by the petitioners and highlighted by Elaine Smith today, highlighted for a drug that is available in the mainland continent at £1 prescription and the NHS being charged £54 for that treatment is clearly 5,000% higher than what's being charged elsewhere. So there is an issue, and I'm basing that statement on the evidence that's been provided by the petitioners. It's up to pharmaceutical companies to come back and tell us whether or not that's in fact factually correct. But I'm basing this on what's been presented to this committee today. Pharmaceutical companies have the right to defend themselves at time and place in the future. But clearly there are issues here in terms of how the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, addresses these issues, and I'm sure he'll read with interest the official report of today's meeting and will be armed with the answers that this committee will be seeking when it comes before this committee.
Thank you. Jackson Carlow?
You've recommended a course of action, which I think all members have agreed to, and I think in the light of that, we should move on.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr Carroll, for backing up the position. And Elaine Smith?
Convener, just to see if it's helpful to the committee, I've written to the Cabinet Secretary on Thursday when I found out the details of this. I've also had some other MSPs asking me about it because they've had constituents, and I'm hopefully going to put in some written questions as well, so happy to share those with the committee as well.
Thank you very much. So the course of action is the one I've identified earlier, which is we're going to have an urgent meeting with with Alec Neil. We're going to have a round table after the summer, and I think it's been a very interesting petition and very interesting developments today, although very worrying as well. So can I thank Elaine Smith for coming along and giving us some evidence, and the three petitioners in the room today for also coming along. Obviously you can see we're very interested in your petition, and we'll keep you up to date with developments. Thank you very much again for all your hard work. Thank you. If I could just move on to PE 1472 by Councillor Gordon Murray and Councillor Ray Mackenzie on behalf of Protecting Inter-Island Transport Links on Inter-Island Air Services. Members have a note and the submissions. Now, in a sense, we've already come to a conclusion in this, which is we want to have the convener stroke leader of Western Isles Council to come here. The only additional point I'd ask your permission to proceed with is I do think we should try and get some information from Orkney and Shetland, who do have PSOs within their local authority areas. There are some issues around there, so we should get their experience in writing before we meet the convener. Would that be agreeable?
Yep.
John Wilson?
Seek clarification in relation to whether or not we're joining PE 1472 and PE 1421 in relation to further consideration of these two petitions.
Correct. And there's certainly an argument for the next one as well, but I'll come to that in a second. Are members agreeable with that course of action? We've already partly agreed that. And the sixth and final petition is PE 1473 by Francis Ann Gillis on behalf of Barrow Youth Council on Wi-Fi and Calmark ferries. Member of a note by the clerk and the submissions. Again, members will be aware this petition was picked up by me in advance of our Storn away day. I think we're an excellent group. A lot of work has been done on this, and in fairness to Calmark, I think they've given us an indication of what's happening. Northlink are, I think, further ahead and that give a very detailed paper on what they can do. But certainly what the young people were telling me was, if you're on a ferry for 6 hours, it's a real drag in not having Wi-Fi, including for business community as well. It's very, very important. But I do think it's important we actually have Calmac and Northlink here, so we can run through in detail their actual timetable. Calmac, I think, we need to get that specifically. Also, the Scottish Government have said it's a good idea that it's in a future tender condition, but it's too far off yet. So I think we may just need to clarify with them what's going to happen on that front. Can I just throw open to comments from other committee members? Justin Carlow, are you looking pensive? And
happy to indulge, convener, in this and the previous petition. I do stand by my view that, and I noticed the Scottish Government's response confirmed that these are matters for councillors who are elected and have complete dispensation over whether or not to subsidise the routes, and have chosen not to, and a remedy exists for the public.
Sorry, we're on Wi-Fi.
On the previous one, but we've coupled the two together, I understand.
That was the that was the.
And I see that Calmac have said they will they'll deliver this Wi-Fi thing. I'm not quite sure what more we're going to achieve, but fine.
Thank you very much for that positive comment, Mr. Carlos. So I appreciate that. And I think that's all. Yes, Chick.
Coming back to this.
Chick Brody.
I'm sorry, from a previous life, we talked in the first petition today with the ministers about timelines on delivery. Where government is involved, I think it's fair for us to say we don't just want a business case. We want to know when it's going to be delivered, how it's going to be delivered, what monitoring there is to make sure that they're on target to deliver it, because too many of these things are open-ended. We're going to deliver it mañana. And the message from here is, certainly the message from me is, mañana is not acceptable. We want a time and a date, how it's going to be delivered, timeline the thing, and make sure that we monitor it and make sure it happens. I'm fed up seeing government-supported bodies, either not responding or not delivering stuff in the timescale they say they should.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any further comments before we move on to annual report? No, thank you for that. Then we're going to agenda item 5, annual report. So the final item of the agenda is the consideration of the committee's draft annual report, which I'm sure members have all read. The committee report follows the standard formats agreed by the conveners group. And can I ask then if members have any comments that they wish to make on the draft annual report before it's published? Jackson Carroll? Content. Thank you. Thank you for that. Do you want?
I just think it might be helpful if the committee were updated on Lord Gill's.
Yes, that was
right. We'll could I just formally close the meeting, and there's a couple of points in private I just need to cover. So I now formally close the meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and if members could stay back for 2 minutes, there's a couple of issues in private we wish to discuss.